think about the things in your marketing world that are forever changing, and then juxtapose that with what is unchanging so that you can get a very clean line of thought. Most human beings experience the world, and this is just the way that our brains work, in comparison to one another. Like, we compare elements. That's something we do instantaneously. It's part of our own human computer, right? Like, so everyone understands life in comparison to something else, right? Like, no comparison, no understanding, believe it or not. Therefore, I really like to think in this duality stage, because I think that it's useful for sharpening the marketing sword and being a better marketer, right? If you can start to think about like marketing techniques and even ask yourself that fundamental question, like, what is this hoping to achieve? Like, what's my goal here? Like, I have a hypothesis, but what would the success case look like? Okay, great. And then I can even, kind of like map that out in a way that I think could be really helpful.
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Okay, B2B DM gang, man, we're going to get ready for a great discussion, and it could definitely lead into another one, because we're going to talk about the art and science of lead generation with the CMO. And actually, he wears a couple hats. We're going to talk about that in a second. Of science, Eric Quanstrom. Eric, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so now, before we get into this discussion, talking about the art and science, and who knows where this is going to go. Of course, we start within a lane, but we're going to be expanding, because I'm looking forward to this discussion, because I've seen you talk about this particular topic quite a bit, and I took so many notes. I'm looking forward to see where this is going to go. But if you could tell the B2B DM gang just a little bit about yourself before we get going.
Yeah, sure. On a professional level, you can think of me as a lifelong marketer. I view marketing as a craft and something that I'll be practicing at pretty much throughout the rest of my life. It's what I've been doing. CMO as a title or a role is kind of like my last 6, if you will, companies. So I've been doing this for a while, maybe have a gray hair or 2 to show. That said, I love it. I think that it's endlessly fascinating. There's never a dull moment in the marketing department, especially not over at science. And I really geek out on that kind of stuff. So, for me, this is what I do, who I am. It's a lot of fun.
Well, okay. So you talk about the journey that got you to where you are today. Now I would dare to say that all of those experiences and circumstances, like for many of us, have essentially got you to the point to where you are today. So if you reflect back, what were some of the key learnings that got you to where you are today in that journey?
Boy, this is a podcast in itself. And do you have a few hours? Key learnings, I think one of the things that is interesting to me about marketing is the duality of the things that kind of like never change, that are basic and rooted in human psychology and tendency and the way the brain works, and the things that are frankly ever changing by default: tactics, channels, ways in which we can reach customers or would-be clients. Completely different, marketing mix that I have here in 2023 than, say, decade and a half ago when I was working, back then as the head of marketing for a company called Sitespeed, acquired by Logitech. And so fundamentally, like, almost not even the same profession in that regard. So a fundamental learning for me is that you have to kind of be grounded in foundational kind of concepts and really understanding things about what, maybe it's best to just say, what in marketing will never change? And then what is changing every single day in marketing that I need to pay attention to, and that I need to, kind of like take into account as I build campaigns, as I kind of like rotate strategy, as I make investments, as I embrace different go-to-market ideas and or channels. those are the kinds of things that I think are fun.
Well, and as you were saying, especially start talking about the science of behavior and, the things that people say they do versus what they actually do.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Predictably irrational is the way that is phrased.
yeah, most definitely. And also what we are learning more, each and every day in regards to the brain and how it works. And I think that we're even opening up more doors in that realm.
Yes.
I think there's an interesting interview that's supposed to be coming up on one of the major networks with the CEO of Google talking about Bard and how that tool, if you just want to call it as such, has done things that they just can't explain.
Right.
Like,
yeah, I think that was on 60 Minutes.
That's correct. It's coming as soon as we're recording this. Like, for example, they didn't teach it the Bangladesh language, but yet they asked it some type of question, and then therefore it responded and basically learned it in seconds. And they can't explain how and why because it wasn't part of the initial programming. Now, talking about the whole black box scenario and Pandora's box and things like that, we don't know where it's going. However, I do think, of course, if it's applied correctly, it's going to expand our thinking in a lot of ways in regards to that whole science of human behavior that is really just has been untapped.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. In fact, I would even categorize it as, in my working career, saw the advent of the commercial internet, saw the advent of like what I would call mobile, and kind of like the mobile revolution, saw the advent of cloud computing and maybe even the creation of like the SaaS industry as an archetype that fell out of that. And I think the AI kind of like move, if you will, is going to be bigger than all three of those combined.
Yeah, that's definitely what they're saying. So if you put that into the context of what we're talking about today, and you referenced and said there's some things that have just really should never change, haven't changed, are critical to what we do. If we're talking about it in the context of, the art and science of lead generation, what are some of the things that absolutely we need to continue and possibly even enhance?
Well, as luck would have it, we still don't have automated buying for the most part in any kind of B2B scenario whatsoever. And don't really see that on B2C either, unless you're talking about stocks and automated trading programs that are run to, buy those on Wall Street. For the most part, that buying exercise is an exercise in psychology, in understanding things like positioning on the vendor side, like it's creation of demand. And then it's really an understanding and encapsulation of need, right? So if you really think about a buying exercise, it's always a change management exercise. And that fundamentally won't change, so like no change, no sale. Simple, right? And so what produces that kind of like, let's focus on B2B because that's where I live all day long. Set aside B2C for the moment. If you're thinking about like buying groups, if you're thinking about why does a company spend money on anything, product, service, solution, whatever, all of that emanates from people's need to solve a problem or to meet a goal or to mitigate risk. I mean, those three are pretty much the entirety of why anyone does anything, why exercise that change. And so attaching and understanding that as part of the buying cycle is arguably the big puzzle for every marketer to solve, with a lot of changing variables and a lot of like, again, channels changing for where you can start that journey with awareness or intersect conversations that may or may not already be happening, or planting seeds, in other words, creating demand for that need to change.
Well, as you're talking, I had the opportunity to, interview Matt Dixon, who wrote the book,
Jolt. Yeah.
And, as you're talking, and we refer to the playbook, as we, what we've been doing in regards to affect that change and the decision to change, is we've always been addressing it from a status quo bias scenario and in positioning. And what they're finding is that more deals are actually lost to no decision, so then a competitive decision.
Makes perfect sense.
Okay, so you say it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now the data, to essentially and we could say that, hey, we have a confirmation bias because I believed it, and it makes sense to me. But if we start looking at, how do we help the sale to occur, if we're talking about the science of lead generation, how do I get from, and look at that whole buyer journey scenario, how do I make sure both playbooks, as Matt talks about, we have the status quo bias playbook, and then we have the omission bias playbook. And the omission bias that he refers to in that whole no decision is that, hey, I need to feel confident moving forward that this is the right decision to make. And yes, of course, the whole transformation effort and issue goes along with it, but I don't want to mess up. It's all about the fear of messing up. I don't want to mess up by choosing you to do this or to offer or provide me this product or service.
Yeah. And I think that they go slightly into this into the book, but my own take on it or spin is that I actually think, and I've held this thesis for a long time, that B2B buying is way more emotional than B2C buying, right? So if you think about it, like, where does anyone's professional reputation come from? Like buying, believe it or not, or determining kind of like the tools or the services or the partners or what like goes on in anyone's department that is usually attached to KPIs and some sort of outcomes is what ultimately you wear on your own professional brand. So why wouldn't it be very emotional when I go into a buying situation where I'm going to leverage a company's money to do X, Y, or Z, and then be judged on essentially whether or not that actually happened?
When I hear you say that, it's a shocker because it's not said,
right.
People don't think that way. They're like, hey, well, that's business. It ain't personal. No, wait. Yeah. The saying is business is personal because of that whole, reputation element, perception, success, security. We want to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Totally.
I don't want to put my, have my neck roll or things like that, stick my butt out, on a bad decision. And also too, if you start looking at the problems that need to be solved today, they're not simple anymore.
No, they're not. Yeah. And at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. And it's so funny because like one of the things that is almost never talked about in any kind of B2B buying scenario is what the person who's leading the buying group or the champion, if you will, the main driver of any sale, again, that change management exercise, what they personally are going to pull out of doing something versus doing nothing, right? And then you're back to that omission bias or fear of messing up standpoint, which is like, I'm so glad the Jolt guys kind of like made a move in this direction and started, kind of unearthing the data, because I think there's reams of it about, and anyone that's listening to this has their own sales cycle or their own pulse on their company's sales cycle can start to map to exactly what's going on in that sales cycle when people are ghosting you, when all of a sudden a deal that seemed like it was hot and heavy and really good, like just kind of went stone cold silent. Like, what was it you? Was it me? Like, I don't know. But the bottom line is like there was some force that interacted or interplayed on that deal that now is pushing it to a no decision. So like, and we would look at that in the past saying like, oh, they just defaulted to the status quo. Did they? Like I would ask the threshold question, and this is the bane of all marketers, I think. It's an attribution question, and it's shared by sales. Attribution questions are super hard, and they're getting harder these days, not easier, because you don't occupy the four walls where decisions are made in a buy cycle. You know what I'm saying? Like in a marketer's playbook, and a lot of I get into good debates with my CMO peers around this, because there's a lot of us that came through the ranks that were very data driven and very numbers dependent. We want to attribute everything. Like we just want to put a dollar sign on like a single campaign that drove a lead that converted into a net one and call it an ROI. And the truth of the matter is like, it's way more loosey-goosey than that. Like just even the unpacking the phrase dark social will give you rise to everything you can't attribute. Like anyone that listens to this podcast right now and is thinking takeaways, say we mention a tech tool or say we mention a service or a company, or even like someone listens to me and goes, oh, he works for science. Sounded maybe smart or somewhat coherent. I'm going to check those guys out. How do I attribute that? Can't. Like, unless we're surveying after the fact. Same exact thing happens in the sales cycle, right? So like, what were the forces that pushed that deal into like no man's land, and forced it into kind of like purgatory? Don't know. Can't tell unless I have, magic wand, can tie a golden lariat of truth around like the people that I was interacting with that company for why the thing stalled out. Attribution is a serious hobgoblin in all of this, and it's so ill talked about, so little measured, and really so hard. That's the art part of our jobs.
As you're talking, I'm sitting here and saying, and with the amount of overwhelm that exists currently today, I mean, all of us personally, we experience this, even if we start talking about things that a trail that we went through on the internet, like, how did I get to this page? I don't remember, right? I've got 10, 12 tabs up, and I've got, 300 emails that I haven't, opened yet. And I don't know how I got here.
That's exactly right.
And I've had people do that in just very, what would seem to be like a very short period of time. And I'll give you a quick story example. A client of mine was looking for a particular solution, and I had some, connections in that particular realm. And so I actually had the conversations on their behalf and was an advocate because I knew about the business. I said, look, I'll just go ahead and take care of this for you. So I'm doing it as a value add, right?
Sure.
And so we even had a call that we scheduled, lasted about 30 minutes. That's it. But the timing wasn't right and things like that. And I told him it was initial stage and it was fine. However, not even 90 days later, 60 days later, they inform me, my client says, oh, well, we've been looking to move forward on that. I'm like, what? And I said, well, what about that client? What about that solution provider that I had talked to? And they're like, what was their name again?
I love it.
I'm like, oh, I mean, but that's, you go through that experience. You're like, how could you not remember? We were even on a call, and it's not like it's, totally different from what you were attempting to do, but I think that's just the reality of today. Everybody's just slap bombarded. And this is where I'm going with this, is our thoughts and thinking around the science of brand recognition. I think that's out the window these days.
Or it's more relevant than ever. So I'm fond of saying that, and you used one of them, that every person, and so listeners, think about it in mental image of you as a prospect, right? So I would argue that everyone is susceptible to the 3 Bs all day, every day in their working lives, all the time. And those 3 Bs are busy, bombarded, and bewildered, right? So we're overscheduled. I have yet to meet a desirable target, an executive, someone you would prospect into that doesn't have like a pretty damn full calendar. Like meeting, after initiative, after project, after whatever, right? Like, I think we can all agree that the busy part is just like, yeah. Bombarded is exactly what you said before. Most human beings are rifling through hundreds of web pages a day. They have, 45 tabs open. They have an inbox that's full, a voicemail, inbox that's also full, and checking, sporadically or whatever their system is. We're busy and we're bombarded. And then, of course, that leads to, I think, bewilderment, which is, hey, you ever tried to buy, like, let's just stick to SaaS software for a moment because it's so easy. My favorite way of demonstrating this is like, works at HubSpot now, but the Martech 5000 was a site that was originally produced like 8 years ago with not even 5,000 marketing titles on it that any marketer could use for any, like, hey, I want an ABM platform tool. Okay, great. Like, go to the Martech 5000, check out that category. That number is up to like 9,000 right now. So if you were back to the buy cycle and back to fear of messing up, if you were a smart person that wanted to evaluate all their options, you could schedule meetings with every vendor in the category and be done sometime in 2030. Right? So all of a sudden, buying is harder than selling, isn't it? Right? And that's bewildering. And so for those reasons, I think that is so present on kind of like today's stage. Now, let me get back to your question. Does that mean brand, another B word for that matter, is insignificant today? In fact, I would argue just the opposite. Brand typically is what we feel familiar about. And I'll give you a little story to illustrate this point. I remember when I was like, I want to say 8 or 9 years old, and I went to my mom and I said to her, Mom, I see so many ads for Coca-Cola. And yet, like, everyone drinks Coke and everyone knows what Coke is. Why do they need to advertise so much? And she stopped in an apparent moment. She turned to me. Maybe this is when my marketing career started. She answered a question with the question. She goes, and how do you think everyone learned about Coca-Cola? And all of a sudden my gears started turning. I was like, oh, it's this chicken and egg problem of brand reinforcement, where all of a sudden familiarity and the product, like, it hasn't changed since that time when I was a 9-year-old kid to now. Like, Coke's still the exact same. And yet there's a whole generation of buyers that have all been inculcated and exposed to arguably thousands, tens of thousands more media messages from that one brand.
Okay, that makes sense to us all because, I mean, we've experienced and we know the global brand and the recognition piece. But let's go back to your example talking about the market, Marcon or marketing, now 9,000 or 10,000.
Sure, yeah.
I'm not going to spend my way into brand awareness like a Coca-Cola when I am one company on that list. And, oh, hey, by the way, I'm not the one that has the multi-million-dollar pockets.
Sure.
What do I do?
Well, I think that it's a slightly different equation because Coke is B2C and they think that any human on the planet can access and use their product. B2B brands actually are in a much smaller TAM, relatively speaking, total addressable market. And so, I'd probably be a little bit challenging in saying that if I was the company and I had designs on growing and market share, at some point I am going to fundamentally attack that question. How do I build brand amongst my target audience, my list of buyers always? So like, I think that as a startup, you can't really ask that question and functionally answer it because you just don't have the resources. You don't have the level of investment. You don't have the juice to conquer your entire TAM at once. In fact, I think that would be a bad strategic mistake if you tried. That said, I think that in the life cycle of a company, you better believe that companies that went from startup to now like stalwarts of, say, the B2B industry, I would throw out an example like Salesforce, right? Like, Salesforce is thinking about, how do I brand myself with every sales leader on the face of the planet, like come hell or high water. And I don't have this on actual fact because I'm not within their business or their company's four walls, but I can see through their actions that is something they're very much focused on. So to that point, I think that answers some of the question.
It does. So I think, to me, my interpretation of that is knowing the different stages and phases of you being able to have an operation or a company that is continuing down the growth path.
Absolutely. Isn't that the desire of every company? If you're not growing, you're dying. And so, that's key to, I think, the marketing departments of all viable companies these days.
Well, so then the question is when. Okay. And what I mean by that is, all right, so I'm in that, launch startup phase. I do need to, and what I heard, one of the numbers that I always use is, a fast to 50, meaning I want to get to 50 customers as quickly as I possibly can because it impacts my reputation. It impacts my ability to raise capital. I mean, all those types of things. Yeah. So where do I start thinking in regards to levers? This lever from a lead generation perspective is the one that I'm working here. Yeah. Maybe I work this one a little bit differently while this one's going, or shift, how does that work? Because I think that's really the difficult thing is people are like, well, when should I? And then when things don't exactly click perfectly, like, oh, well, I just think it's too soon for the stage that we're in. Like, how do you know that? Yeah, the short answer is you don't. But since this podcast is called The Art and Science of Lead Generation, I think I'll take a scientific kind of foray or stab at that answer. And what I'll say is you form a hypothesis. So like, the hypothesis is, well, what go-to-market channel? Why? Why would that be a good, investment, use of time, resources, what have you? And then test. And whatever you come back and learn, all of a sudden either invalidates the hypothesis or it supports the hypothesis for further investment. And thus the cycle goes on. So that's the short answer. And we could talk about tactics and channels and, things to look at.
But what I would say to your example of like fastest to 50, that's smart advice. The other benefit to getting to 50 customers, and we see this all the time at Science, the company, especially when we're working with really small to medium-sized business folks that are just now starting out and building brand. Luckily, they've come to us because they intuit that outbound is kind of the closest thing to network-based marketing that might have built their business previously, right? So most people that are new startups or that hang out a shingle, it's the founders themselves or the people running that business that get all of the first few clients. How do they do it? Through their own network. That's why I call it a network sale. Now, that sale is fundamentally different from outbound, largely because when you're tapping your own network, there's a trust proxy that exists between your brand or your personality, your history, your resume, if you will, why people would want to listen to you. That isn't there in an outbound scenario whatsoever. And so what's interesting to me about the fastest to 50 is once you get to 50, you can start to study like the commonalities, the lookalikes, if you will, amongst your buying set. And I would look for those commonalities around who was in the buying group, what titles did they have, what were their needs, what were the problems and the pain points that they like saw you solving for them. The more crisp and specific you can be on this, the better. So that then you can start to roll that forward and say, okay, in my next hypothesis, this channel, I'm going to look for all the people that might have the exact same like needs, problems, issues with this title. And all of a sudden are the hallmarks of the makings of a really good go-to-market strategy for the next group. And then the next and the next. And so your answer to the win is kind of like this sequential test, lather, rinse, repeat kind of motion that when people get it right, like they build on strength and they grow their businesses like fast.
Well, as you're talking, it sounds great. It's the practical application piece, especially if you're starting to talk about a founder-led organization, because it's like you're saying, they expect that sales activity, say outbound or whatever the case may be, to be as easy as it was for them to get their connections on and network on board. It just doesn't work.
I'll tell you one of the areas, and I'll put it in a big, large bucket. So I'm painting with a huge brush here. One of the areas where this goes so wrong is where people bring to bear in a situation where it doesn't warrant it, things that worked either at a previous company, things that worked for them before personally, like to a new situation. And it's almost like it ignores that entire hypothesis stage. And then they spend a lot of time. You know what? We used to do tons of events back when I was at XYZ company, and we would spend, $500,000 per trade show. And that's the way that we generated all of our leads. And then you bring it to a new company and like you go spend that 500,000 and all of a sudden you're left with, what did I just do? Right? I'm using that as an easy example, but like the point there is I think that there's a lot of mistakes that can be made in this hypothesis like phase, which is always. And so, like, how do I get into the business of running controlled tests or trials or, experiments and doing it like small to large? Because that would be the best way of proceeding forward almost always.
Okay. So, gosh, there's so many questions that come out of that because like I was saying, that's not what we often see. And it is, I think also too, what you're saying is about, I used to do that over here and therefore I'm going to do it here. I think that's one of the contributing factors for, the CMO as well as chief sales officer, the tenures being, only like 18 months.
For sure.
Is because of that. And I need to get to sales right away. And so therefore I'm relying on my intuition and I'm relying, on my experience in order to be able to replicate, those outcomes in this new organization. And that's kind of what I was talking about in regards to, the whole art and science and how fundamentally, yes, some things still remain, but the reality is though the world is changing at such a rapid pace that I can it has outpaced my intuition. It has outpaced my experience. And so therefore I must be humble and take a very different approach. And part of that approach is kind of like what you're talking here is use the evidence, learn how to use evidence.
Yeah, I think that there's also, to something I was kind of riffing on earlier, there's also things in a marketing department that are unchanging. and will probably never change, especially since the advent of the commercial internet. I don't know of a business, no matter how small, that doesn't view their website as their public face to the world in 2023, right? So we take it on faith, but if that's true, then guess what? That website is going to be your public face, which means that it's an intersect point or a leverage point for your brand forevermore. So that's a great place to start with a lot of your hypotheses and experiments, and one that I think definitely should always be part of, a modern marketing plan, strategy, where you're looking resource wise. So that intersect point, I think, is a really important one that's relatively unchanging. I would argue that one's social footprint is probably the same. The social networks may change, like when I started my career in marketing, like Friendster and MySpace were still a thing. Not so much anymore. Will Facebook be a big deal in 5-10 years? I don't know. Will Instagram, will TikTok? Who knows? But the bottom line is attached to your brand, those are relatively stable and fairly unchanging places of communication or to get the message out to a given brand. And therefore, I think are worthy of time and investment in an evergreen sense. Okay. To your point.
Well, you bring up an interesting, I guess you'd say, quandary that often exists in regards to, if we're talking about B2B, are many of these other social platforms where I need to be investing any effort?
If your buyers are there.
And that's,
that would always reverse that equation and say, hey, like, to the best of my abilities and understanding, like, where does the people that I need to talk to first, the people that would show up in my sales cycle, the people who would help make decisions around whether or not to do business with me, are they on those channels? And if so, to what extent? And so the answers to those questions actually are very informative to the go-to-market decisions of, your marketing spend, or investments in them.
Well, I think what you answered and what I'm hearing is you need to go back to the whole test thing.
Yes.
Because the assumption may be my customers aren't on TikTok because I'm B2B.
Right.
In fact, they might be.
They might be.
That's a scary proposition.
No scarier than staring at an empty pipeline.
Okay, granted, you win.
So, I think of a lot of this stuff as it's marketing's hard. Like, let's take a quick step back and say that if there was an easy button, everyone would have been pushing it. And frankly, marketers ruin everything. So, like, we look for the easy button always and are usually very fond of like maximizing or pushing it to death once something is working.
I want to hit on that because I actually saw a presentation where this guy posed that question and then therefore went on to explain it, but was asking the question of, as marketers and sellers, as a group of marketers and sellers, at what point does our advantage come? Before or after marketers ruin everything? And it's like, what? First of all, everybody was just taken aback by the question itself.
Sure.
And then he went through and explained it, which you kind of explained when you said it a second ago. So if you could explain, what do you mean by marketers ruin everything?
Marketing is the endless search for formulas to replicate things like leads, right? Like, how do you find or create good leads for your business? That's kind of at the root of everything that we're talking about here with different forms of window dressing. And so once I find channels, once I find methods, once I find shortcuts or formulas, I'll stick to the science part of it. Like, you've got a hypothesis, you've discovered a formula. Man, it would be the stupid, foolish, like ignorant marketer who would then turn their back on a formula that's working just to try anything like new at its exclusion. So in a sense, like, you're going to push and push and push the formula until you see diminishing returns. And then you're probably going to push after that too, because frankly, it's hard to inertia and habit or strong little hobgoblins that keep us doing things that we do all the time. And that's marketers ruining everything, right? So like, we get on a channel and it starts to really work. We're going to saturate that. We're going to let that sucker roll forever and ever.
And so hold on to that. And this is so in addition to what you just said right there, what this guy went on and shared is that then as marketers, when we do find a formula that works, we tell other marketers. And then sometimes, well, he's saying that most of the time, this is what happens.
Yeah. Most marketers can't shut up.
That's right. And so then we start teaching others how to do it. And then we start having mastermind groups about it. And then it becomes saturated. So our ability where, we were having the success when we had the formula, it gets diminished a lot faster than it would otherwise because we just shared it with everyone.
Yeah. I'll tell you a funny story along those lines. Maybe not even funny, just kind of reality. I remember my first head of marketing role in the early 2000s when I first discovered Google AdWords, right? And it wasn't even called AdWords at that time. And I remember distinctly placing bids that were 5 cents and under for like a keyword and a click. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is so cool. I can get clicks for so cheap. Fast forward to today where I don't even think we're paying less than $2.50 on your average, kind of like word or phrase that we're bidding on in any AdWords campaign that we're running. So you could chalk that up to inflation, or you could chalk that up to like every AdWords ad that's placed or ad that shows up, that's an auction. So you've got more people in the auction, all of us marketers, who want the eyeballs that happen to hit on that keyword phrase. So to me, that's the marketers ruin everything. Obvious example 101.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so if we're talking about the art and science, we talked a little bit about Chat GPT and opening up our thinking. We talked about split testing and some of the analytics and validation associated with that. What about some potential prognosticating here?
Sure.
3 years out, what are we looking at?
Well, I think you're going to see a lot more AI involved in every part of every business, and especially the marketing department, largely because so much of marketing is about messaging. It's about positioning. It's about pattern recognition, all things that are very, very, very much in the sweet spot, if not the dead bullseye of tools like OpenAI's ChatGPT and others that have built, kind of branches and scaffolding around it. So to me, you'll only get more of that going forward, which is probably a good thing if you think about who couldn't benefit from more relevant, on point, kind of rightly worded, for lack of a better way of saying it, messaging in any marketing that they're going to do. That's maybe even better targeted to the patterns of people that resemble, and I use that kind of almost sloppy word, but I like it, those lookalikes that are actually in and doing business with you or being sold to currently, right? So that ultimately every vendor on the face of the earth that I can imagine wants to ever get tighter and better and, really squeeze down the feedback loops around how well they can address the pain points that their business supports. I can't think of the opposite ever being true. Oh, you want that? It doesn't matter. No, here's exactly how we solve this problem in great detail with the how and the relevancy. And oh, by the way, 12 other marketers just like you said this was worth their time.
So I think what you're saying right here, if we start looking at this whole art and science and piece of lead generation, is we chatted about the art and science associated with humans. We talked about the art and science, about data. We also talked about the art and science, in the future. So I think we hit several different components or elements in regards to the art and science of lead generation. But if you were to say, I'm sitting here today, I'm a B2B digital marketer. My one most major and most important takeaway from this discussion, what do you think it should be?
I think it would be what I said at the outset, which is think about the things in your marketing world that are forever changing, and then juxtapose that with what is unchanging so that you can get a very clean line of thought. Most human beings experience the world, and this is just the way that our brains work, in comparison to one another. We compare elements. That's something we do instantaneously. It's part of our own human computer, right? Like, so everyone understands life in comparison to something else, right? Like no comparison, no understanding, believe it or not. Therefore, I really like to think in this duality stage because I think that it's useful for sharpening the marketing sword and being a better marketer, right? If you can start to think about like marketing techniques and even ask yourself that fundamental question, like, what is this hoping to achieve? Like, what's my goal here? Like, I have a hypothesis, but what would the success case look like? Okay, great. And then I can even, kind of like map that out in a way that I think could be really helpful for most other my peers. I'm speaking to my peers now.
I think that's as they say, it's easier said than it is done.
Sure.
I mean,
always
out, but and I do think there's some oftentimes, and here's where I think all of us can seek and create and generate an opportunity, is that we have other people put their eyes on the situation. Because if it's just our own, going back to what we had talked about, is change has outpaced our experience and ability and our intuition. We have to recognize that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I study that too in like a lot of these AI tools. Isn't it interesting how well and how easily we give kind of or cede control to the tool? Because we think to ourselves, man, I'm seeing millions of patterns and millions of like data points all being absorbed in that answer. And my brain couldn't go there that fast and do the exact same kind of calculations going forward. I think there'll be more of that. Now, the trouble or the challenge there is, and that's probably another whole podcast on like the ethics of AI. The trouble will be when the machines like well outpace our own cognition and our own cognitive abilities.
Well, and that's the part and the scariness piece about that interview with the Google CEO is like, how do we actually prevent some of those or put up walls in some of those areas where, maybe it starts running, some of these games, global nuclear warfare, and maybe it starts taking out power grids and things. I mean, how do we prevent those things? And I think that's the worry about a lot of humanity. But firstly, we need to get better leads.
We do. I oftentimes think, and this is going to, again, like Gen X me to the nth degree, but I think of that Porno for Pyro's 90s song, We'll Make Great Pets by, the tune that once you get in your head, you can't ever forget it. We'll make great pets. We'll great pets. Anyways, I think about that all the time. Like if our AI overlords at some point determine like that they've got this solved better than we do.
Oh man. Well, like you said, that's for another show.
Totally.
Eric Quanstrom, man, how does the B2B DM gang get in touch with you and hopefully to continue this conversation?
Yeah, sure. Anyone that's interested in continuing it, I'm so easy to find. It's not even funny. And turns out a lot of people do. There's very few Eric Quanstroms on LinkedIn. I don't even know if I've ever encountered a second. And then my company, Science, is Science without an S, CIENCE.com.
Eric Quanstrom, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.